Good morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Sheikh Hamza happens to be one of the most prominent Muslim scholars in the Bay Area. He's a teacher, writer, and scholar, and he's also the co-founder of Zaytuna College, the first Muslim liberal arts college in the country, established where else? Here in Berkeley, California. He is an advisor to Stanford University's program in Islamic Studies and the Center for Islamic Studies here at the GTU. He also serves as a member of the Board of Advisors of George Russell's One Nation, a national philanthropic initiative that promotes pluralism and inclusion in America. He also serves as vice president for the Global Center for Guidance and Renewal. Recently, Hamza Yusuf was ranked as the Western world's most influential Islamic scholar by the 500 Most Influential Muslims, edited by John Esposito and Ibrahim Khalil. Sheikh Hamza has authored any number of encyclopedia articles and research papers and several books, including Purification of the Heart, The Content of Character, The Creed of Imam al-Tahawi, Agenda to Change Our Condition, Walking on Water, and The Prayer of the Oppressed, and is forthcoming The Helpful Guide. And I just want to say a little bit about Sheikh Hamza's work. Basically, we can sort of characterize it in three parts. On the one hand, Sheikh Hamza has been very influential in reviving the authentic tradition of Islamic scholarship, which had suffered all sorts of misformations due to colonialism. Zaytuna College is an example of this, of going back to the roots of Islamic traditional education. And for that reason, he has a great deal of reputation and credibility among, even non-scholarly Muslims. At the same time, he emphasizes that true understanding of tradition goes beyond the letter of the text to the spirit that inspires the letter. So he has always emphasized in his research that an understanding of the texts of Islamic scholarship requires knowledge of the purification of the heart, of the ascetic and mystical tradition of self-development, which enables one to understand the actual text of the letter. And then the third part of his work is applying this to the contemporary situation. So Sheikh Hamza has been an outspoken and passionate critic of all kinds of social justice and extremism, whether it's the extremism of global elites and militarism, or the counter-extremism of pseudo-Islamic extremists. Sheikh Hamza has been credited for, say, persuading Ed Hussein to abandon extremism. So Sheikh Hamza's work can basically be described as a kind of bridge building and connecting of worlds, connecting the worlds of tradition and modernity and the worlds of West and East, which blends in perfectly well with Graduate Theological Union's and Pacific School of Religion's mission and purpose. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Sheikh Hamza Yusuf.
Thank you. What do I do? Cancel? Don't you wish you could do that with lots of things? Now what? It's not advancing. Okay.
There we go.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. It was I guess that's my introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. I appreciated that. I always take those things with a serious grain of salt, like being the most influential Muslim scholar in the West, because I'm having a hard time influencing my 16-year-old right now. So we know about influence. Also the description of a bridge builder, I'd prefer rather to be described as somebody who's just trying to show bridges that are already there. We don't need to build bridges. building bridges is a lot of effort and work. I think we should use the ones that are already there, but oftentimes the fog of war and other things cloud our vision. When there's a lot of fog in San Francisco, you can't even see the Golden Gate Bridge. This is one of those things I think that relates to all of us. I was really happy, and the reason that I chose to do this was because of the topic. I've been actually not doing a lot of things lately, trying to get the things I already have to do done. But this topic is one of the most fascinating topics to me, and it's fascinating for a number of reasons. One of the most important is the complete disconnection that so many people have with wealth. And I want to give you an example. How many people know John Robbins? Not that many, I'm surprised. I love John Robbins. He's a wonderful guy. His father was one of the founders of Baskin and Robbins. He wrote Diet for a New America. That was his first revolutionary book, saying don't eat ice cream. He's an extraordinary human being. He, as a young man, idealistic, went to Vancouver, built a log cabin with his wife, lived on an island in Vancouver, and without electricity, raised his children there. His son, this is kind of the 60s, people here can relate to this, his son named Ocean is also doing things. So he was part of that idealistic generation that listened to too many Bob Dylan songs, and took this stuff seriously and dropped out. What's interesting is when he came back after several years, he began to advocate for a lot of things related to social justice. Diet is one of them, because we don't realize the connection between what we eat and ethics, which is very important. Not just the ethical treatment of animals, which is one aspect of it, because the animals today are no longer farm animals. They are literally commercial products. They have nothing to do with a traditional idea. Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. McDonald's now owns the farm. And it's not the pig and the cow having a good time anymore. So, but one of the things that intrigued me, I got his book, The New Good Life, Living Better in an Age of Less. And he talks about this crisis that we're in and how it's actually an opportunity. But what really struck me was he admits, and I think courageously, that he lost all of his money in this crisis because all of his money was invested with Bernie Madoff. And so I think it's just so amazing that somebody who I believe is a truly ethical person, but the fact that he was living off stolen money, because a Ponzi scheme, you're not living off your money. That was already spent. You're living off the money of other people that have now invested into the Ponzi scheme. And so this, to me, illustrates profoundly this incredible disconnect that we have in the United States between our wealth, how we invest it, and what the wealth is actually doing out there in the world. And this doesn't just mean investment. Somebody who wrote best-selling books has money to invest. Most people don't. But it also means the ethical choices that you make every day when you buy. Right? And now the corporations are wising up to this, so now they're putting like fair trade stamps, and a lot of this stuff is unregulated, so we really don't know what's going on. But they recognize that there are people that are deeply troubled by the type of world that we're living in right now and the imbalances that we have. So I want to look at a pre-modern person who dealt with these things. And one of the things about Dante is very troubling for Muslims, and I'll get to that later. But Dante is also somebody who, and I think the thesis of his indebtedness to the Islamic tradition is airtight. For somebody that knows the tradition very well and knows Dante reasonably well, I think Asín Palacios, who's the Spanish Catholic priest who first put forward this thesis that Dante had been influenced by what's known as the nocturnal or the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, where he goes through hell, he's guided by Gabriel, and then ascends to the heights and then into paradise, ultimately to experience the beatific vision and to come back. The similarities are so extraordinary, and many of the things that you find in Dante are not from Christian tradition, and Christians know this, that it's usually seen as from the imagination of Dante. Now, to say that Dante stole, like they say, mediocrity is to borrow, genius is to steal, there's nothing really wrong with stealing. Shakespeare was constantly stealing things from most of his plays are plots taken from other playwrights, but the genius is making it your own. This is titled Lenders, Leopards and Lions. He divides hell into the sins of the leopards, the sins of the lions, and the sins of the wolves. And then the violence of avarice, because we don't really think of avarice as being a violent crime or a violent sin, but in this medieval tradition it was. So these are my musings from these trenches in Dante's hell. The pre-modern worldview among Abrahamic people and amongst all people, the pre-modern world was a metaphysical world. People before modernity lived in a world in which they recognized that this was not the world. This was Maya, it was Waham in the Arabic tradition, it was completely evanescent, it was something that was transient by its nature, would dissipate before we knew it, but it also was symbolic. And this is why Plato, for instance, did not want image makers. And this is one of the things that Neil Postman argues in Amusing Ourselves to Death, that in the Decalogue, the second commandment, not to make any graven images unto God, and not to make any images whatsoever. I mean, if you read the original commandment, it's very specific about not making images at all. And Postman argues that if a God who is a complete abstraction, the idea of God, wanted human beings to understand him or her or it, however you want to phrase it, the God would have to be a God that was understood through symbols, through abstraction, in the mind, not tangible. And so the idea of idolatry was such an anathema to the Abrahamic traditions. The iconoclasts, influenced by the Muslims during the Byzantine period, actually destroy a lot of the icons. It's interesting that the only icons that we have from that period in the late 7th and early 8th century are the ones that were from the monasteries that were protected by the Muslims. So the Greeks went around destroying all these icons. So the pre-modern world was a world of metaphysics, and Plato felt that the danger of images was that it would take people, they would be now twice removed from reality. So if you have a television and you're watching reality TV, you're actually twice removed from reality, because the actual thing that's happening that you're watching, whether it's recorded or live, are images of images. And so he saw the danger of having those images. Now, one of the aspects of the pre-modern worldview was morality was at the center of the human condition. The 10 Commandments are universal commandments. You will find these in many, many traditions, some form of the 10 Commandments. It's actually quite extraordinary how widespread they are. If you look at the core ethics of the Quran, it's clearly from the 10 Commandments. The obstacles to fulfilling the 10 Commandments are the 7 deadly sins, according to St. Gregory the Great, one of the great Catholic leaders. Now, in Dante's world, sin was something you struggled against. It was not something you indulged in. It was something you actually struggled against. If you go to Las Vegas, as you enter into Las Vegas, there's a big banner in the airport that says, "Surrender to your desires." And then what happens here stays here. Right? So one of the things that advertising people have learned is that the 7 deadly sins make great selling points. So have the Mercedes, and you're going to look better than everybody else on the road. You're going to have respect. You'll also get the envy of other people. Luxuria. So these seven deadly sins were central to that worldview. But one of the interesting things about the Mount of Purgatorio was at the base was pride. And Dante doesn't really deal, the whole Divine Comedy in the Inferno, pride is constantly there, but it's not mentioned in the same way that the other sins are mentioned, because it's just understood that is the root problem. Greed and pride were the root problems, according to St. Thomas, of the human condition. But what's interesting about this mountain is as you climb up the mountain, it gets lighter and easier. So it's the opposite of a worldly mountain. The spiritual mountain gets actually easier. Now, one of the things about Jesus, which is interesting, I mean, there are many things interesting about him, but one of the things that's very interesting is that when he was, one of the teachers of law came and heard them debating, noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now you could look at this, the 613 commandments of the Torah, or you could look at it as the 10 commandments. The most important one, Jesus answered, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. What Jesus does in this incredibly succinct manner is to sum up the 10 commandments. Because the first 3 commandments are about loving God, about honoring God, believing in God, about honoring the Sabbath. And then it's loving the neighbor. It's don't kill, don't steal. Those are acts of hatred towards the neighbor. Honor your parents. Those are the closest neighbors that you have growing up. And don't covet your neighbor's goods. Don't bear false witness. This is all loving the neighbor. So he reduces the 10 commandments to 2 commandments. Now, what's interesting about that is he makes it a positive. Most of the 10 commandments are negatives, but he makes it a positive, that love is a positive force in the world. And this is really Dante's vision in the Inferno, because Dante sees that love is at the root of all of this. You have, and he ends his Paradiso with love. So it's the last line in the entire poem. He has love excessive, love perverted, and love wanting. These are the human problems. Now, Dante, he finds himself in the middle of his life. He was born in 1265. This takes place in 1300. And Dante he's a fascinating character for a number of reasons. One of them is that he is a devout Catholic, and yet he's deeply influenced by rationalism. He's definitely a secularist. He really wants to see separation of church and state. He's also very anti-clerical. In fact, he's never been beatified. I mean, he stuck half the popes in hell. And he had a problem with the church, but like all great patriots, their greatest act is to point out what needs to be corrected. You see, the jingoistic type of approach never works. Those are the flatterers that tell you there's nothing wrong. It's the people that point out what needs to change. And that's what he was really involved in doing. But he enters the Inferno and, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. I had an idea of doing a theme park based on the Inferno. Because we love theme parks, right? I was actually on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride with my children, and I realized at Disneyland that Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is kind of a mini Inferno. Because he actually goes to hell in that. I don't know if you ever read this. It's a terrible thing to do to a 5-year-old. It's just an incredibly frightening thing. But Mr. Toad actually, he goes to hell, but then suddenly it's like, no, you get a second chance. And so you're back out. Right, start over. But he enters what's interesting is, first of all, he sees this incredible array of humanity, and he's like, I can't believe hell has undone so many. And the first group that are actually in a vestibule outside of hell proper, they're in hell, but it's outside of hell proper. And these are the trimmers. These are the people that were neither for good nor evil. They were only for themselves. And they have a banner that has nothing on it, representing the meaninglessness of their lives. And they're running about to and fro with these insects biting them and stinging them on their heads as reminders of what they should have done. But then he moves into the sins of the leopard, which are the sins of youth. And he has in there luxuria, gula, avaritia, and ira. Luxuria is lust. It's the Latin word for lust, which is an interesting word that is related to a kind of spreading out. Laxaria is a looseness. We talk about loose morals. The idea of not being able to contain oneself. And then you have gula, which is where we get gluttony from. And it's a wonderful, almost onomatopoeic type word because it just sounds so much like the actual act. And then avaritia, which is a beautiful word, which we get avid reader, is a greedy reader. It's from the same root from a Sanskrit word, avate, which means to crave or to desire. And so greed is a craving, which is also hungry is related to greed. It's the same. If you go back to the ancient cognates, you'll find that greed and hunger are the same. So the idea of greed is a craving, and we know the second noble truth of the Buddha is craving is at the root of our problems. So the sin of luxuria is an interesting one. I want to talk, and this is always, religious people are always going on about lust and pornography, and this is the obsession of Christianity for too long. Right? I mean, Christians, and it's kind of driven everybody mad. I think they've kind of gone to that extreme because they just couldn't take the sermons anymore. But, I want to say that I don't think people are really aware of this problem. I think a lot of good people and not to say other people are bad people, but people that people that aren't engaged in these type of things don't really understand the extent of this problem, and when a society, we're producing almost 90% of all the pornographic material in the world, and this is becoming, it is by far the predominant downloading now going on the internet. There's a wonderful, you can Google this if you'd like. There's a wonderful image on YouTube of an investment banker who's live from Australia, and he's talking about interest rates, and behind him is one of the investment bankers there downloading pornography. This showed up on live TV, so he kind of gets caught. He's at work, supposed to be crunching numbers, right, and he's downloading pornography, and somebody comes and points it out to him that they're on live TV back there, and he's kind of in a state of shock. But this is a major problem now in terms of a loss of time and these things. So what's interesting about lust, Dorothy Sayers, who people know her as a mystery writer, she was also, I think, a first-rate theologian. Dorothy Sayers argues that there are two reasons for lust becoming predominant in a culture or in a person. In a person, it can be sometimes from what she calls an abundance of animal spirits. In other words, they're a lusty person. They're somebody that has a lot of vital energy, and this vital energy can be dissipated in sexual pursuits. But the other one is that she said that in a society that has lost meaning, she said that this pursuit can become a type of, in essence, it's a distraction from the troubling emptiness that is there. And this is something that Kierkegaard recognizes, because Kierkegaard talks about the aesthete, the aesthetic man. He said at the high level, and the aesthete, this is what's so interesting about Kierkegaard, is that Kierkegaard recognizes that the guy at the opera, do you know, the guy at the opera titillating his senses and experiencing these things and is obsessed with the aesthetic life is no different from this guy down on the pornographic downloading. That it's the same type of impulse that is causing us to pursue these things. That's my little graphic there. Now, in the United States now, it's estimated that only 3% of boys and 17% of girls have never seen internet pornography. And I know just from my own experience on the internet, you can find images. Like when I was trying to get some of these images, pornographic images popped up on the image thing in Google, and you're supposed to report them. So people upload these images. This is a real problem in our country. And then if you look at the statistics that are going on beyond belief, it's quite tragic. So I will just, as a side note, I participated and wrote a paper based on Dante's Inferno with the Witherspoon Institute. This is called The Social Costs of Pornography. And my paper's in here. My paper was originally titled Climbing Mount Purgatorio, Reflections from the Seventh Cornice, which is the cornice of lust. And they changed it. I guess Catholics kind of wanted the Muslim to have a non-Catholic title, maybe. I don't know. But gula, which is gluttony, that image, the person that put that up, I really wouldn't want to do that to somebody. The prevalence of obesity in the United States is really quite stunning, what's happening in our country. Obviously, some of it, one of our scientists at the National Institute of Health said that we're making food now like crack cocaine because they found that high fat and high sugar, rats cannot stop eating it. And so the people unfortunately, corporations know these things. And this is the ruthlessness and the impersonal nature and the really amoral nature and immoral nature. But this is what's happening. So you can see since 1974 to 2004, just look at that. And if you look, these are doubling. And one of the things about exponential growth, if you understand the doubling factor, and I'll get into that when we talk about usury, but it's very dangerous to see doubling happening. Now, avaritia, which is greed, this American family, I'm not calling them a greedy family. This is more just a normal family in America. It's obviously, they were from, I think, Texas, very Christian. She's got the Bible as the centerpiece of their possessions, which I think is quite lovely. But if you look at the amount of goods they have, and this comes from a wonderful book of people that went around the world taking pictures of the average person in that country, and they would have the family come out and have all their possessions. And you see places like Bhutan where they've got like a few blankets and some pots to cook with, and they're beaming with radiance. They look so happy. And I can attest to this because I actually lived with Bedouin in West Africa. And the Bedouin that I lived with, the tribe that I lived with, which moved 3 times in the year, lived in tents. The possession was always contained in a chest, all their worldly possessions in a chest. And it was a great gift to live with them because one of the things I learned from them is you do not need very much. Our needs are very, very few. And one of the things about those people is I never really saw any depression or people that were troubled. They were really happy people. Prozac hasn't had a market there yet. This is from St. Thomas. It is a sin directly against one's neighbor, greed. Since one man cannot overabound in external riches without another man lacking them. It is a sin against God, just as all mortal sins, inasmuch as man contemns things eternal for the sake of temporal things. That's at the essence of this. And then ira, I'm going to get back to greed because it doesn't go away when we get to violence. Ira is wrath and anger. Now, here we are in Dante's extraordinary vision of hell, which actually comes from the Islamic tradition, which has circles going down. And some of the Prophet ﷺ did not write this, but some of the Muslim writers had it burrowing into the earth. And they also, unlike the Christian tradition, there is a tradition in Islam that ice is the deepest punishment in hell, which is where Dante gets this frozen lake where the demon is. Now, as Dante enters into limbo, these are for the righteous pagans. What's interesting is he puts Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Sina there, and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. So this is, because limbo's not that bad. It's probably like Motel 6 as opposed to the Fairmont. It's really not that bad. It's green, it's got the 7 mountains that represent the 7 virtues, and you're not really suffering there, but you're distant from God, so that's the punishment. And then Dante is informed also that when Christ died, he came and took all the Old Testament prophets out of there and brought them into heaven. So obviously it can't be that bad if those great men were put there. And then the next circle is the lustful, the gluttonous, the avaricious, the prodigal, the wrathful, and the sullen. He's got 2 groups of the wrathful, and they're the ones that express their wrath, and they're in the lake, and they're all fighting each other. And then the sullen ones that interiorize their anger and become depressed, resentful, and angry at the world. But they're not expressing it outwardly. And then we move to Styx, which is the hateful river, and he borrows from Greco-Roman tradition. And then he has the heretics. And heretics, eriseia in Greek, comes from a word which means to choose for yourself. So the heretics are those who choose for themselves, no outward authority. In many ways, we are the heretical generation. The modern world is a world of heretics. I did it my way. Frank Sinatra, the great singer. So and then he moves into the 7th circle. And this is where the sins of violence are. And they're the violent that are against their neighbor. And these are the tyrants, the warmongers, the murderers. These are the people that are the purveyors of war. So violence are the sins of the lion. These are the sins of manhood. In the way that the leopard, which are the sins of incontinence, incontinence, which now just means incontinent to stool and urine in medical terminology. It means you can't hold your urine or your feces. It used to mean you just couldn't control yourself, akrasia. It was the idea of just somebody that did not have the moral fiber to hold themselves within the boundaries of morality. So the sins of the lion are the violent ones. Now, if you look at the world that we're living in right now, again, the exponential factor here is quite frightening. But these are the types of money that we're putting in to military. And this is a much more accurate, one of the things that the official records want to say is that our military budget's about 20%, and that's the government's official one. But if you actually look at all their finagling and see how, it's quite clever how they do it. I mean, it's wonderful. If you look at New York is the only state in our union that has a budget. They have to actually have a fiscal budget that stays within the boundaries. That's a clause in their state constitution that they actually cannot do deficit financing. Well, how do they get around that? They were 200 million short not that long ago, so they sold Attica Prison to themselves for $200 million. I'm not making this up. This literally happens. This is the type of stuff that goes on. Clinton, they always talk about how during the Clinton period, it was, last time we didn't have a deficit, there was a surplus. Right. Look at really what happened, and you'll see that they were digging into the Social Security funds. So they didn't have to borrow the money, they just took from future people. Seriously, I mean, this is what's happening. So if you look at the warmongering that goes on, and we have to deal with this. This is our country. Here's our budget in relation to the rest of the world. We're 15 times greater than all of the next group combined, and 12 of these are strong allies. I mean, if you look at Canada, it's number 14 there. And they're a strong ally of the United States. And if you look Saudi Arabia, that's just corporate welfare, by the way, because Saudis never use their hardware. They never fight wars. I mean, when they got into trouble, they called on America. So all the weapons are just there waiting for the Americans to use, right? But they're number 8. all those petrodollars. The military-industrial complex, is at the root of these sins of violence. And this is something that, unfortunately, because we as Americans, we view ourselves as always wearing the white hat. We don't, collateral damage that's not terrorism because, hey, we didn't mean to kill them. Even though they have statisticians in the Pentagon that tell them how many civilians are going to die, probabilistically. They know that. But we didn't intend to do it. It's just an unfortunate byproduct of war. So this is the type of environment. Now, this was an act of violence against this country, but Iraq was our act of violence against a country that had nothing to do with this act of violence. And so these are the cycles of violence that are perpetrated constantly, and we can never get out of them. And so these violent sins, and then violence against themselves, because it's interesting how they're the same sides of one coin, right? Two sides to the same coin. Now, and then he's got blasphemers he has the blasphemers. And then the sodomites. Now, what's interesting about the sodomites in Dante's, that's not fair. A friend of mine did that. What's interesting about the sodomites is if you look at Ezekiel. Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them. This is also consistent with the Quranic narrative. One of the sins of the Sodomites was they raped guests. And in the Quranic narrative, they come to the house of Lot and they demand that he surrender their guests so that they can rape their guests. And so this is a violent society. They express it through sexual violence, but it is a violent society, and I think that's important to remember. And he actually has a kind word to one of them who was his teacher, Dante. Now we get to the usurers, and this is the crime against art. That's how it's produced. Now, art in the medieval worldview was production. It was the idea of production, that you produce things. Christ, in his 3-year mission, the only time he gets violent is with the usurers, chasing them out of the temple. Now, if you look at the Abrahamic, you can look at these. These are all in Exodus, Leviticus. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. And then to a foreigner you may charge interest. It's interesting, St. Jerome, and if you look at the early church fathers, St. Jerome has a very famous statement about ubi jus belli, ubi etiam jus usuri. If it's just to wage war on them, it's just to charge usury. That's how he understood that the stranger was actually somebody who was an enemy. And then this was the Jubilee, right? You know what they would say today, our economists? Oh, that creates moral hazard, right? Seriously, that's exactly how they would look at that. And then this is Ezekiel also, right? So, and this is a just man who does what's lawful and right. He doesn't eat on the mountains where the idolaters used to eat, nor lifted his eyes to idols, nor defiled his neighbor's wife, nor approached a woman in her impurity. If he has not oppressed anyone, but he has restored the debtor to his pledge, he's robbed no one by violence, taken no usury. If he had not extracted usury, nor taken any increase, but has withdrawn his hand from iniquity and executed true justice between a man and a man. If he has walked in my statutes and kept my judgments faithfully, he is just. Now, in the Jewish tradition, and the Jews in European tradition were forced into usury. It's very interesting if you study, a lot of the European sovereigns would have the Jews as tax collectors. This is like having African American police in inner cities. Do you know, it's kind of, I mean, that's an opposite example of that. It's trying to deflect. But it's what the tax collector, when he was Jewish, if he would come, they would see the Jew. and not the sovereign. So they would see the Jew as an oppressor. And that was literally designed. I mean, these people were Machiavellian in their outlook. So, but this is from the Talmud, Every Man's Talmud, by Dr. Cohen. One method of earning a living, which was condemned in scathing terms by the rabbis, was usury. A man who practiced it was precluded from giving evidence in a court of law. Come and see the blindness of the usurers. If a man call his fellow a villain, the latter proceeds against him even to the extent of depriving him of his livelihood. But usurers take witnesses, scribe pen and ink, and write and seal the document to the effect. I mean, Woody Guthrie put that in a more popular phrase when he said, some men will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. And so that's what he's alluding to. But he said, no matter how far you roam, you'll never see an outlaw take a family from its home. Not like the bankers. Whoever has money and lends it without interest of him, it is written, he that putteth not out his money to usury shall never be moved. Hence you can learn that if a man lends on interest, his possessions will be moved. Usurers are comparable to shedders of blood. Cato the elder was asked about usury. He said, usury? Ask me about murder. He equated it with murder. And there's reasons for that that the modern people don't understand, unfortunately, because we don't fully grasp it. One of the most important things, and this is why it's so good to see this issue being addressed. Justo Gonzalez, and I would recommend reading this book, Faith and Wealth, A History of Early Christian Ideas on the Origin, Significance, and Use of Money. In Gonzalez's book, what he shows very clearly is one of the most central and important issues that Christians were grappling with was the ethical use of wealth. They were obsessed with it in their writings. But what he says, on the outlines of the actual relationship between faith and wealth, there is also remarkable unanimity. It's one of the few things they really agreed on, to the point that certain themes appear again and again. Usury, by which is usually meant any loan on interest, is universally condemned in the early church. The one possible exception is Clement of Alexandria, who may have held that the prescription of loans on interest applies only to loans to other believers. But even this possibility is based only on a debatable interpretation of a single text. So usury was seen as condemned. And this is obviously the chasing them out. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything. Right? Even your enemies. So this is really abrogating that idea of lending to the enemy, which is why he put it in there. And it's interesting that modern Christians have justified usury with the Luke story about the man who comes with the talents, and he gives each one, he gives them 10 and 5 and 1, and then 2 of them work it, and the third one, he just hides it. And he says, oh, I knew you were an austere and cruel man, and you take what's not yours, and you reap what you don't sow. So I just hid it, and here it is. Here, and he said, your condemnation of me is my judgment against you. You should have known that I would have wanted more. And you should have put it in a bank and gotten interest. So he uses the example of a wicked tyrant that everybody hates and says, well, there's Jesus. He's saying usury is okay. Very weird interpretation, but hey, that's scripture. Yeah. The nature of the sin called usury has its proper place and origin in a loan contract. This financial contract between consenting parties demands by its very nature that one return to another only as much as he has received. The sin rests on the fact that something the creditor desires more than he's given. Therefore, he contends some gain is allowed to him beyond that which he loaned, but any gain which exceeds the amount he gave is illicit and usurious. This is an encyclical, a papal encyclical, which is basically church doctrine. The Pope writes it and then sends it out to all the churches. This is not ex cathedra. In other words, it's not considered infallible because the popes rarely use ex cathedra as a doctrine. And but this was sent in 1745. It was all over by Pope Benedict the 14th. And then it was again applied to the encyclical to the whole of the Roman Catholic Church in 1836 during the reign of Pope Gregory. And Dr. Noonan, one of the great Catholic scholars, says that it's impossible to say that there was not universal agreement on the prohibition of usury. Charging for the loan of money is unjust as such, for you are selling something that doesn't exist. This is the important distinction that the medievals understood, that money is a means of exchange. It is not meant in and of itself to be a source of income. You can invest money by buying goods and products and selling them as a businessman. But when you loan money and make money off the money, you have perverted the purpose of money, which is a means of exchange, and you have made it an end, as a good is an end. This is how they understood it. The word in Greek for usury was tokos, which means to give birth. And this is why he has them on a barren, sandy, completely unfertile, because what they've done is they've made something that should be unfertile in its essence, but it causes things to grow if it's used properly. And so this is St. Thomas saying some things like food are consumed by use, so that the use can be separated from the thing. When we let someone use such things, then we transfer the ownership of the thing itself. So if you sell a sandwich, you've transferred the ownership of the sandwich. And so the use of the sandwich, which its consumption, is you can't charge them for that. And that's why bankers literally get their cake and eat it too. Literally, it's amazing. So now when we let somebody use such things, then we transfer the ownership. If we tried to sell wine and its use separately, we would be selling the same thing twice over, or selling something non-existent that would clearly be unjust. By the same token, then it is unjust to lend wine and then ask for the twofold recompense, the restoration of some equivalent and charge for its use. This is what usury is, a use charge in such cases. There are, however, things which are not, and this is beautiful. St. Thomas always preempts what you're going to object to. Right? He's quite stunning in that he constantly does that. He thinks, okay, what are they going to say to this one? And then boom, he answers you. So he said, there are, however, things which are not consumed by use. A house is used by living in it, not by pulling it down. So here we can separate the thing from its use. Transferring the ownership, for example, while reserving the use for a time or vice versa, allowing someone the use and retaining its ownership. This is why one can illicitly charge for a house's use and later ask for its return, as happens in letting and renting. So now Aristotle tells us money was invented for the purpose of exchange, and that its prime and proper use is in its consumption and disbursement by being spent in transactions. It follows that it is in principle wrong to charge for the loan of money as is done in usury. Now in the Islamic view, الذين يأكلون الربا لا يقومون إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. Those who devour usury will rise only like the one who rises to be knocked down by a demon as if possessed by madness. My teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah, who's one of the foremost authorities on Islamic finance, said that this is the boom-bust cycle of a usurious society. They rise only to be knocked down. And this will happen again and again throughout history. The Quran says, those who consume interest cannot stand except as one stands who is being beaten by Satan, a demon. Oh, you have believed, do not consume usury doubled and multiplied, but fear that you may be, in order to be successful. Now, in traditional views of all forms of wealth acquisition, the most unnatural and odious is that by means of usury, Aristotle and the Politics. John Addison, I love this one. A moneylender, he serves you in the present tense, he lends you in the conditional mood, keeps you in the subjunctive, and ruins you in the future. I mean, really great stuff. Right? Nothing like the English for stringing words together. Usury dulls and damps all industries, improvements, and new inventions, wherein money would be stirring if it were not for this slug. Provision, and that's why, how are they trying to stimulate the economy now? They just keep lowering the interest rate, right? Just keep lowering it down. But there's deeper problems, and I'm going to get to this. Anyway, John Maynard Keynes says this very interesting, that he was brought up to believe that the attitude of the church to the rate of interest was inherently absurd, and that the subtle discussions aimed at distinguishing between the return of money loans from the return of active investments were merely Jesuitical attempts to find a practical escape from a foolish theory. But I now read these discussions as an honest intellectual effort to keep separate what classical theory has inextricably confused together, the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital. And he invented the marginal efficiency of capital. So that's the nice thing about inventing your own terms, is that you define them as well. But basically, the marginal efficiency of capital is what it's worth, which is not necessarily the interest rate. So most economists would see it as the same thing. He saw it as different, but his point is that they recognize there is a difference between the capital itself and the interest itself, and they distinguish between those two. But its prohibition is for a very different reason. I already mentioned that from. Now back to Dante. Now we're in the fraud. Now why is greed violent? Fraud is not one of the 7 deadly sins. And the 7 deadly sins, Aquinas says deadly sins are capital sins, which means they breed other sins. In the same way that you have moral virtues are virtues that are the source or the matrix of other virtues. So courage, when you think of generosity is a virtue, but generosity is subsumed under the virtue of courage, because you can't be generous without courage. You're literally going against the fear of losing your wealth by giving it to somebody else. And so it's a very sophisticated system, but fraud, St. Thomas identifies, these are called the daughters of the 7 deadly sins. And he has, each of the sins have daughters. Like one of the sins, the daughters of lust, is that you begin to hate God. You begin to lose any sense of spirituality because you're so subsumed by the sensual. But in the daughters of greed, he has treachery. He has fraud. So fraud is a daughter of greed. It's a daughter of avaritia. And it's important to note also that the deadly sins are not acts. They are states of being. So greed is not an act. It's a symptom when you see somebody acting greedily. What he's doing is a symptom, but the actual disease is a state of being. And so he's got the first ones are the panders and the seducers, the fraudulent men. There's a book now that was on the front table of Borders and Barnes & Noble called The Player's Bible. And it was a book on how to seduce women. Like it teaches you how to seduce women. And what's interesting about this is that apparently there's a whole underground group of these guys that communicate on internet and exchange how they do these things. I read an article about this and it was quite shocking to see this. But this is a type of fraud. Like to know the right things to say to a woman in order to seduce her. Right? And that's what they do. So they're fraudulent. And he has this horrible Geryon, which is from Greek mythology, which is a monster with a beautiful face. And it's got a poisonous tail. And that's how he personifies fraud. And so, and this is also, he's got the flatterers who are literally up to it in crap. Like they're full of it. Literally, I mean, in hell. So he's got the gluttonous are being rained down by feces rain. It's like, so the flatterers are those people. And this also is, he would probably today put the ad executives down here if he was alive. The Simonists are those who sell, from Simon Magus in the New Testament, who tries to buy the gifts of the Holy Spirit and puts, obviously the church was having a difficult time with that. And then diviners, astrologers, and magicians, he would probably put people like, and he put the people of his time, like the people that read Dante knew all the names because they were familiar with all the people. They were like celebrities of the time. So he would put probably like these people, diviners, he would put these guys on CNN who do the prognostication for where the stock market's going. You know, telling you what to buy and things like that. And then he's got the barators who are what the Simonists are to the church, the barators are to government. They're the people that accept bribes. And then he's got the hypocrites, the thieves, fraudulent counselors. And it's interesting, the man that advised Caesar to cross the Rubicon is here. So it's the people that give fraudulent advice, like the people that told to go into Iraq, for instance, under false pretenses, because many of them knew And this has all come out, so we know that. This is the type of... And then sowers of scandal and schism. This is where, unfortunately, for Muslims, he has the Prophet Muhammad with Ali. Now, I want to, and this is difficult for me, but I would like to defend a little bit Dante. Dante put him in among the schismatics. There is another group in the heretics, which is where the false prophets were. He is not. I'm sorry, not in the. The false prophets are in the. They're in the 8th circle. I think they're in the first Bolgia. He does not put them with the false prophets. He puts him with the schismatics. Now, the schismatics are the Eastern churches. And this is, in essence, acknowledging that these are believers. But they saw schism was actually because it created violence and rupture in society. It's also not a disease of fraud, and this is pointed out by the commentators in Dante, that he puts him here because the fraud is in their own misperception of the world. This is how he does it. And I also want to say that these people that he puts here are not the people. And that's why people say, oh, he put his enemies in hell and he was just cruel. No, these are personifications. He is personifying the idea of schism, and that was something very close to a deeply divided world between Christians and Muslims who were fighting then, as unfortunately we are now. But then he puts the falsifiers, all right? Now, what's interesting to me, he's got the counterfeiters and the alchemists and the people that the coin. Now, I want to look at, this was 110 years ago when the Earl Lectures were founded. Look at what the dollar, the purchasing power of the dollar was. All right, because what you could buy, you see, has diminished to the point. So, for instance, my grandfather, who sold bubblegum as a 10-year-old boy in San Francisco, down on Market Street in 1906. He used to sell it, I think, for a penny, little packages of bubblegum. So all you have to do is look at how much that package costs today. And in those days, it was organic, right? So you'd even have to double the price to get the organic bubblegum. But just look at the purchasing power of the dollar that has been declining, and then our debt, 56 trillion. And it's actually higher than this now, but this is the current liabilities and unfounded promises, okay? We only have about $15 trillion in circulation. And this is what we owe in liabilities, Social Security, Medi-Cal, all these things, okay? I mean, this is a real crisis. So our current national debt's at about 12 trillion, right? And our budget was close to 2 trillion. So now, most of this, again, a large portion is going to defense, and another portion is going to interest on the national debt. Now, this is old wine in a new bottle. So, because in the old days, you had gangsters. And the thing about gangsters is that they would just go in and usually have, they would cover, and they go in and rob the bank. Now they get on the boards. It's much more clever. Serious, and this is not exaggeration. There's a book called The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And this is what these people have been doing. And it's really quite stunning. Now, I just look at this statement. Wall Street, with its vast banks in New York City and associated banks in all other large cities, suggested that there was a prospect of most disastrous panic that the world had known. Unless Congress gave them emergency currency, neither could these great swivel chair operators of Wall Street exploit the commerce that would follow between the war nations and our country as a great profiteering game unless Uncle Sam came to their aid and financially, that is, would give them more currency, okay? Instead of aiding the people as the government should have done, Congress immediately passed an Emergency Currency Act to furnish the banks that the speculators controlled all the money they should need till they could operate the Federal Reserve Act. The speculators received from Uncle Sam nearly $400 million. Okay, that would be about $400 billion today under the provisions of the Emergency Currency Act. And when the Federal Reserve Act really got to operating, they had nearly $400 million at one time under that act, and they could get as much more as they wanted. That's Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was the father of Charles Lindbergh, who flew across the Atlantic. He was a congressman that was opposed to the Federal Reserve. But my point is that it's the same game, too big to fail. This is how, it's all fear. And this is one of the things that the panderers and the seducers, they use fear and desire to trick people and to get what they want. Now, it is an old maxim and a very sound one that he who dances should always pay the fiddler. Now, sir, in the present case, if any gentleman whose money is a burden to them choose to lead off a dance, I am decidedly opposed to the people's money being used to pay the fiddler. No one can doubt that the examination proposed by this resolution must cost the state some $10,000 or $12,000, a lot of money in 1837. And all this to settle a question in which the people have no interest and about which they care nothing. These capitalists generally act harmoniously and in concert to fleece the people. And now that they have got into a quarrel with themselves, we are called upon to appropriate the people's money to settle the quarrel. Because they wanted money over a stock collapse that happened. And this is an old game. Now I want to talk about America's great fairy tale. You see, every culture has to have some really profound fairy tale. And ours is the Wizard of Oz. Now, the Wizard of Oz, about the time the Earl lectures were being initiated, there was a character named William Jennings Bryan. In fact, 110 years ago, he would have just found out that he lost the 1900 election for president. He ran on the anti-imperialism platform. He was a pacifist. They called him a coward. They considered him a coward. He was a pacifist. He was also pro-farming. And our farmers, people have no idea how much our farmers have suffered in this country. Really. The suicide rate is the highest amongst farmers. I mean, these are people tied to the land, and when the land's taken away from them, and they're forced into this agro-business, Gresham's dynamic, which is that the cheaters drive out the honest people. Now, I just want to look at this fairy tale because Baum was basically giving us an allegory. At this time when he was writing this, the great debate in the United States was over finance reform. And Dorothy represents the American, the good American, from Kansas, good Midwest state. She's on a farm, and Baum describes her aunt and her uncle never smile. It's a barren farm because it's drought. And then basically, she goes to this land. She lands on the Wicked Witch of the East, Wall Street, and the Munchkins, the little factory workers, are freed, and they're really happy. And then the Good Witch of the North, which is where all the support for the populace were, come down, and she gives her the silver slippers, which turn into ruby slippers in the film. But in the book, they're silver slippers. And then she's told to go to Oz because she wants to get back to Kansas. Follow the yellow brick road. They were on the gold standard. In 1873, this country removed the silver standard, and they demonetized silver, which created an incredible burden on farmers because gold was rich people's money, silver was poor people's money. And it was made illegal for people to use, and that's Bryan's famous the cross of gold. Don't crucify us on a cross of gold. So the yellow brick road leads to the emerald forest, the greenbacks, because the currency was tied to the gold. And in the book, they all wear emerald glasses that have a string connected to a gold belt. And the scarecrow represents the kind of simple farmers that were intelligent but not educated, and they needed a brain. With the thoughts, I could be thinking I'd be another Lincoln if I only had a brain. And then the Tin Man is the industrial factory workers who are dehumanized by industry. And this is why the Tin Man in the book says that he used to be a real human being that was cutting the wood, but he would cut himself, and the tin makers would put him back together until he became completely tin, but now he's lost his heart. Because this is the alienation, the dehumanization that happens in factory workers. And then the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, who was called a coward and needed the courage and the power to do this. They wanted to restore bimetallism. This was Hamilton's original vision of this country, to have a bimetal economy. Under a gold standard, the amount of credit, and by the way, at the end, when she kills the Wicked Witch of the West, which is where all the farmers were being held. It's the yellow Wilkies, who are the Chinese workers on the railroad, and the winged monkeys, who were the Native Americans. He was actually quite racist towards Native Americans, but they talk about how we used to live on the land and in the forests until these evil people came and took us over. But how does she kill the Wicked Witch? Liquidity. Because that's what they needed. They needed cash infusion. And she kind of dissolves into thin air, right? What does she say? Now, I want you to really think about this. I'm coming to a close. I know that because I have to come to an end here. Under a gold standard, the amount of credit that an economy can support is determined by the economy's tangible assets. Since every credit instrument is ultimately a claim on some tangible asset, but government bonds are not backed by tangible wealth, only by the government's promise to pay out of future tax revenues, and cannot easily be absorbed by financial markets. A large volume of new government bonds can be sold to the public only at progressively higher interest rates. Thus, government deficit spending under a gold standard is severely limited. The abandonment of the gold standard made it possible for the welfare status to use the banking system as a means to unlimited credit. They have created paper reserves in the form of government bonds, which through a complex series of steps, the banks accept in place of tangible assets and treat as if they were an actual deposit. This is just on a ledger in the Federal Reserve, as the equivalent of what was formerly gold. The holder of a government bond or of a bank deposit created by paper reserves believes that he has a valid claim on a real asset. The law of supply and demand is not to be conned. As the supply of money, of claims increases relative to the supply of tangible assets in the economy, prices must eventually rise. Thus, the earnings saved by the productive members of society lose value in terms of goods. So if you're saving money, you're losing money in this system. When the economy's books are finely balanced, one finds that this loss in value represents the goods purchased by the government for welfare or other purposes. Really, it's all defense spending, with the money proceeds and interest of the government bonds financed by bank credit expansion. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make it illegal, as it was done in the case of gold back in the 30s. If everyone decided, for example, to convert all his bank deposits to silver or copper, right, they'd lose their purchasing power. So the financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret of the welfare state's tirades against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the confiscation of wealth. Gold standards stand in the way of the insidious process. It stands as a protector of property rights. If one grasps this, one has no difficulty in understanding the status antagonism towards the gold standard. That was Alan Greenspan. Okay? That's a true statement. Alan Greenspan, a man who is furnished with